His smile.
Things to the Lady Fail Tebara. Only Lasil appeared to have noticed. The Shido walking past paid no mind to two Gaishine women. Fail jerked her hands free. How do you know that name? She'd had to give more of her name than Fail, of course, but she had chosen Fail Bashir once she realized that none of the Shido had a clue who Davram Bashir was. Aside from Aleandra and the others, only Galena knew the truth, or so she had thought. And who have you told? I listened, my lady. I overheard Galena speaking to you once. Anxiety touched Aravine's voice, and I have told no one. She did not sound surprised that Fail wanted to hide her name, though clearly Tebara meant nothing to her. Perhaps Aravine Carnell was not her true name, or not all of it. In this place, secrets must be held as closely as in Amador. I knew these women were yours, but I told no one. I know you intend to escape. I've been certain since the second or third day, and nothing since convinces me otherwise. Accept my oath and take me with you. I can help, and what is more, I can be trusted. I have proved it by keeping your secrets. Please. The last word came out strained, as if from someone unused to saying it. A noblewoman, then, rather than a merchant. The woman had proven nothing beyond that she could spy out secrets, but that in itself was a useful trait. On the other hand, Fail knew of at least two guys who had tried to escape and been betrayed by others. Some people really did try to feather their own nests, no matter what the circumstances. But Aravine already knew enough to ruin everything. Fail thought about her hidden knife again. A dead woman could betray nothing. But the knife was half a mile away. She could think of no way to hide the body. And besides, the woman could have curried favor with Savannah just by saying she thought Fail was planning escape. Taking Aravine's hands between hers, she spoke as quickly as the other woman had. Under the light, I do accept your pledge and will defend and protect you and yours through battle's rack and winter's blast and all that time may bring. Now, do you know anyone else who can be trusted? Not people you think you can trust, people you know you can? Not with this, my lady, Aravine said grimly. Her face shone with relief, though. She had not been sure Fail would accept her. That it was relief rather than anything else made Fail tend to believe in her. Tend to, which was not to say completely. Half would betray their own mothers in hopes of buying freedom, and the other half are too afraid to try or too stunned to be trusted not to panic. There must be some, and I have my eye on one or two, but I want to be very careful. One mistake is one more than I'll be allowed. Very careful, Fail agreed. Did Savannah really send for me? If she didn't, it seemed that she had. And Fail was quick about reaching Savannah's tent. Quicker than she would have liked, in truth. It was irritating to leap to avoid Savannah's displeasure, but no one paid her the slightest heed when she walked in and stood meekly by the entry flaps. Savannah's tent was no low Aiel structure, but a wall tent of red canvas large enough to need 2 center poles, lit by near a dozen mirrored standards.
Hey, Christopher, how you
2
doing?
gilded braziers gave a little
Hope you're
warmth,
doing well.
emitting thin tendrils of smoke that eddied out through the smoke holes in the roof. But the interior was little warmer than outside. Rich carpets, the snow carefully scraped away before they were laid, made a floor of reds and greens and blues, tyrant mazes and flowers and animals. Tasseled silk cushions lay strewn about the carpets, and one chair, a massive thing intricately carved and heavily gilded, sat in a corner. Fail had never seen anyone sitting.
Bravo, Chris. J'espère que tu passes une bonne journée.
Never seen anyone sit in it, but its presence was supposed to evoke the presence of a clan chief, she knew. She was just as happy to stand quietly with her eyes down. 3 other Gaishine with golden belts and collars, one a bearded male, stood along one wall of the tent in case some service was needed. Savannah was there, and so was Thurava. Savannah was a tall woman, a little taller than Fail herself, with pale green eyes and hair like spun gold. She might have been beautiful except for a strong hint of avarice around her plump mouth.
C'est bon de voir. J'espère que tu vas bien.
Mouth. Little about her really seemed Aiel, beyond her eyes and hair and sun-dark face. Her blouse was white silk.
Hell yeah.
Her skirt divided for riding and also silk, if a dark gray, and the scarf folded around her temples was a blaze of crimson and gold, also silk. Red boots peeked out beneath the hem of her skirt when she moved. Jeweled rings decorated her every finger, and her necklaces and bracelets of fat pearls and cut diamonds and rubies as large as pigeons' eggs, sapphires and emeralds and fire drops paled anything Sumerian had. Not a single one was Aiel made. Therava, on the other hand, was all Aiel, in dark wool and white algoda, her hands bare and her necklaces and bracelets gold and ivory. No finger rings or gems for her. Taller than most men, her dark red hair touched with streaks of white, she was a blue-eyed eagle that it seemed must devour Savannah like a crippled lamb. Fail would rather anger Savannah 10 times than Therava once, but the two women faced each other across a table inlaid with ivory and turquoise, and Savannah met Therava glare for glare. "What is happening today means danger," Therava said with the air of someone tired of repeating herself, and perhaps about to draw the knife at her belt. She caressed the hilt as she spoke, and not entirely absently, Fail thought. "We need to put as much distance between ourselves and whatever it is as we possibly can, and as soon as we can. There are mountains to the east. Once we reach
Nice,
them, we can be
Christopher.
safe until we gather all
Yeah, I'm
the
still
septs
smoking
together.
a little bit of
Septs that would never
roaches.
have been separated if you hadn't been so sure of yourself, Savannah." "You speak of safety," Savannah laughed. "Have you grown so old and toothless you need to be fed milk and bread? Look, these mountains of yours are how distant? How many days or weeks when we must crawl through this cursed snow?" She gestured to the table between them where a map lay spread out, weighted down with 2 thick golden bowls and a heavy 3-pronged golden candlestick. Most Aiel disdained maps, but Savannah had taken to them along with other wetland customs. "Whatever happened is far away, Therava. You agree that
It's
his
still
son
something to
asked
smoke.
every wise one. This city
Maybe
is full
roaches,
of food,
but that do the
enough to
job.
feed us for weeks if we remain here. Who is there to challenge us if we do? And if we do? You have heard the runners, the messages. In 2 or 3 weeks, 4 at the most, 10 more septs. Perhaps more. This air will be melted by then if these wetlanders from the city can be reached. We will travel quickly instead of having to drag everything on. Fail wondered whether any of the city people had mentioned mud. 10 more septs will join you, Therava said, her voice flat except for the last word. Her hand tightened on the knife hilt. "You speak for the clan chief, Savannah, and so I was chosen to advise you as clan chief, who must listen to advice for the good of our clan. I advise you to move east and keep moving east. The other septs can join us as easily in those mountains as here, and if we must go a little hungry on the way, who among us is a stranger to privation?" Savannah fingered her necklaces, a large emerald on her right hand like green fire in the light of the stand lamps. Her mouth tightened and seemed hungrier for it. She might have known privation, but despite the lack of warmth in the tent, she no longer chose to. "I speak for the chief, and I say we will remain here." There was more than a hint of challenge in her voice, but she did not give Therava a chance to meet it. "Ah, I see that Fail has come, my good, obedient Gaishine." Taking something wrapped in a cloth from the table, she stripped away the cloth. "Do you recognize this, Fail Bashir?" What Savannah held was a knife with a single-edged blade, a hand and a half long, a simple tool of the sort that thousands of farmers carry, except that Fail recognized the pattern of rivets in the wooden handle and the chip in the edge. It was the knife that she had stolen and hidden away with such care. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Gaishine were forbidden to possess any weapon, even a knife, except when cutting meat or vegetables for cooking. She could not help jerking when Savannah went on, though. As well, Galena brought me this before you could use it, for whatever purpose. If you stabbed someone, I would have to be very angry with you. Galena? Of course. The Aes Sedai would not allow them to escape before they did as she
cheers,
wanted.
Chris.
She is shocked.
You know what? Since you're here, let's do
Savannah's laughter was amused. Galena knows what is required of Gaishine, Fayil Bashir.
let's
What
do
should
a
I do
dab.
with her, Tharava? That is advice you can give me. Several wetlanders have been killed for hiding weapons, but I would hate to lose her. Tharava tipped Fayil's chin up with a finger and stared into her eyes. Fayil met that gaze without blinking, but she felt her knees tremble. She did not try telling herself it was only the cold. Fayil knew she was not a coward, but when Tharava looked at her, Fayil saw herself as a rabbit in that eagle's talons, alive and waiting for the beak to descend. It had been Tharava who first told her to spy on Savannah, and however circumspect the other wise ones might have been, Fayil had no doubt that Tharava would slit her throat without the slightest qualm if she failed her. There was no use pretending the woman did not frighten her. She just had to control that fear. If she could. I think she was planning to run away, Savannah. But I think she can learn to do as she is told. The rough wooden table had been set out between the tents in the nearest open space to Savannah's tent,
Dr.
100
Dabber.
paces away. At first, Fayil thought that the shame of being naked would be the worst of it. That and the icy cold that pebbled her skin. The sun sat low in the sky. The air had grown colder, and it would get much colder before morning. She had to stay there till morning. The Shido
I
were
just
good at
load.
learning what shamed wetlanders, and they used shame as a punishment.
Load it in
She
there.
thought she would die of blushing whenever anyone looked at her,
And then
but the Shido who passed by did not even pause. In itself, nudity was no reason for shame among Aiel. Aravine appeared in front of her, but she stopped only long enough to whisper, "Keep your courage," and then she was gone. Fayil understood. Whether or not the woman was loyal, she did not dare do anything to help. After a very short time, Fayil no longer worried about shame. Her wrists
I
had been
turned the,
tied
it has
behind
the
her,
light
and
usually
then her
up here,
ankles
but I
had
turned
been
that
doubled
off just
back
because
and
it
tied to
saves
her
the
elbows.
battery.
She understood now why Lasil and Arla had been panting. Breathing was an effort in this position. The cold bit deeper and deeper until she was shivering uncontrollably,
Turn it
but
on.
even that soon seemed secondary.
Is that a...
Cramps began to burn in her legs, her shoulders, her sides,
There we go.
bunching muscles that seemed on
Is that
fire,
that temp?
twisting tighter
At
and tighter
2
and tighter.
lights.
She focused on not screaming. That became the center of her existence. She would not scream, but oh, light she hurt. Savannah ordered that you were to remain here till dawn, Fayil Bashir, but she did not say you could not have company. She had to
And once
blink
it
several
turns
times
green,
before she could
good
see
to go.
clearly. Sweat stung her eyes. How could she be sweating when she was frozen to the marrow? Roland was standing in front of her, and strangely he was carrying a pair of low bronze braziers filled with lighted coals, with pieces of coal around the leg of each to protect the flames from the Seeing her stare at the braziers, he shrugged. Once a night in the cold would not have bothered me, but I've grown soft since I crossed the Dragon Wall. She almost gasped when he set the braziers beneath the table. Warmth flooded up through the cracks beneath the planks. Her muscles still shrieked with cramps, but oh, the blessed warmth.
Cheers. And
She
what's
did
cool
gasp
about
when
this,
the
it
man
has
put an
a
arm across her chest and the other across her bent
a
elbows.
self-clean mode.
Suddenly, she realized the pressure was
Just do
gone
that.
from her elbows. He had squeezed her.
Now
One of
it's
his hands
self-clean.
began working at her thigh, and she almost screamed as his fingers dug into knotted knots, but she felt the knots begin to loosen. They still hurt, His massaging hurt, but the pain in that one thigh muscle was changing in kind. Not growing less exactly, but she knew that it would if he continued. You do not mind if I occupy myself while I try to think of a way to make you laugh, do you? He asked. Suddenly she realized that she was laughing, and not hysterically. Well, it was only partly hysteria. She was trussed like a goose for the oven, and being saved from the cold for the second time by a man she thought maybe she would not stab after all. Savannah would be watching her like a hawk from now on, and Tharava might be trying to kill her as an example. But she knew she was going to escape. One door never closed, but another opened. She was going to escape. She laughed until she cried. Chapter 10. A Blazing Beacon. The wide-eyed maid was more used to kneading bread dough than doing up rows of tiny buttons, but eventually she finished buttoning them into her dark green riding dress, curtsied, and stepped back, breathing heavily, though whether from the effort of concentration or just from being in the presence of the daughter heir was hard to tell. The great serpent ring on Elaine's left hand might have had something to do with it, too. Just over 20 miles in a straight line would take you from the manor of House Matherin to the river Aranin and all its great commerce. But the distance was far greater in actual miles to be covered through the Chishan Mountains, and people here were more accustomed to cattle raids across the border from Urundi than any sort of visitor, especially a visitor who wrapped the daughter heir and an Aes Sedai into one package. The honor seemed beyond what some of the servants could do. Elsie had been painfully conscientious in folding the blue silk gown that Elaine had worn last night and packing it away in a large leather traveling chest, one of a pair in the apartment's dressing room, so conscientious that Elaine had nearly taken over the task herself. She'd slept poorly at first, fitful and waking, then slept late when she could sleep, and she was beyond chafing to be on her way back to Camelin. This was the 5th time she had spent a night out of Camelin since learning the city was threatened, and on each trip she had given a day to visiting 3 or 4 manors, once 5, all the property of men and women bound to House Trakand by blood or oaths, and every visit took time. The press of time weighed down her bones, yet presenting the proper image was necessary. Riding clothes were needed to travel from one manor to the next, lest she arrived rumpled and looking a fugitive, but she had to change before settling in, whether it was for the night or just a few hours. Half those hours might be taken up by shifting from riding clothes to a gown and back again, but riding clothes spoke of haste and need, perhaps of desperation, while the coronet of the daughter heir and an embroidered gown trimmed with lace, unpacked from a set of traveling cases and donned after washing, portrayed confidence and strength. She would have brought her own maid to add to the impression if Asanda had been up to keeping the pace in winter, though she suspected the white-haired woman's slowness would have had her chewing her tongue in frustration. Still, Asanda could not have been as slow as this goggle-eyed young Elsie. At last Elsie handed her her fur-lined crimson cloak with a curtsy, and she slung the cloak around her shoulders hastily. A fire blazed on the stone hearth, but the room was nowhere near warm, and recently she could not seem to ignore the cold with any reliability. The girl bobbed as she asked whether she could fetch men to carry down the chests if it pleased Her Majesty. The first time she had done that, Elaine had gently explained that she was not yet queen, but Elsie seemed horrified at the idea of addressing her simply as my lady, or even as princess, though in truth the last was considered very old-fashioned. Proper or not, it usually pleased Elaine to hear someone acknowledge her right to the throne, but this morning she was too tired to be anything but anxious to be on the road. Suppressing a yawn, she told Elsie curtly to fetch the men and be quick about it, and turned for the paneled door. The girl rushed to open it for her, which took longer than if she had done it herself, with a curtsy before opening and yet another
Take
after.
this little bucket out of
Her
here.
divided silk skirts whispered
let's
furiously
put that
against
cream
each
over
other
here.
as she strode out of the room, tugging on her red
We
riding
need the
gloves.
double cleaning.
If Elsie had delayed her one more second, she thought she would have screamed. It was the girl who shrieked, however, before Elaine had gone 3 paces, a horrified howl that sounded ripped from her throat. The cloak flared as Elaine spun around, embracing the source, feeling the richness of Saidar flood through her. Elsie was standing on the strip of carpet that ran along the middle of the pale brown floor tiles, staring the other way down the hall with both hands pressed to her mouth. 2 crossing corridors opened in that direction, but there was not another soul in sight. "What is it, Elsie?" Elaine demanded. She had
Turn my
several
AC
weeds
on.
already
It's
on the
actually a
edge
little warm
of
in here.
forming, ranging from a simple net of air to a fireball that would have demolished half the walls in front of her, and in her present humor she wanted to use one of them, to strike out with the power. Her moods were uncertain of late, to say the least. The girl looked back over one shoulder, trembling, and if her eyes had been wide before, they bulged now. Her hands remained clamped to her mouth as if to prevent another scream. Dark-haired and dark-eyed, tall and plump-bosomed in House Matheron's gray and blue livery, she was not really a girl. Elsie might be 4 or 5 years older than herself, but the way
There
she
we go.
behaved made it difficult to think of her any other way. "What is it, Elsie? And don't tell me it was nothing. You look as if you'd seen a ghost." The girl flinched. "I did," she said unsteadily. That she gave Elaine no title showed just how unsteady she was. "Lady Nelaine, as was Lord Edmund's grandmother. She died when I was little, but I remember even Lord Edmund tiptoed around her temper, and the maids used to jump if she looked at them, and other ladies who visited too, and the lords as well. Everybody was afraid of her. She was right there in front of me, and she scowled so furious." She broke off, blushing, when Elaine laughed. It was more a laugh of relief than anything else. The Black Ajah had not somehow followed her to Lord Edmund's manor. There were no assassins waiting with knives in their fists, no sisters loyal to Elida wanting to whisk her back to Tar Valon. Sometimes she dreamed about those things, about all of them in the same dream. She released Saidar, reluctantly as always, regretful as that fullness of joy and life drained out of her. Matheron supported her, but Edmund might have taken it amiss if she had ruined half his home place. "The dead cannot harm the living, Elsie," she said gently. The more gently because she had laughed, not to mention wanting to box the ninny's ears. "They're not of this world anymore, and they can't touch anything in it, including us." The girl nodded and dropped another curtsy, but by the size of her eyes and the trembling of her lips, she was unconvinced. Elaine had no time to cosset her, though. "Fetch the men for my cases, Elsie," she said, "and don't worry about that." With yet another curtsy, the girl dashed off, her head swiveling anxiously as Lady Nelaine leaped out of the paneled walls. Ghosts. The fool girl was a ninny. The was an old house, if not very long, and the main stairs leading down to the entry hall were broad and trimmed with marble railings. The entry hall itself was a generous space, with gray and blue floor tiles and mirrored oil lamps hanging on chains from the ceiling 20 feet above. There was nothing in the way of gilding and little inlay, but ornately carved chests and cabinets stood along the sides of the hall, and 2 wall hangings were displayed on one wall. One showed men hunting leopards from horseback, a chancy business at best, and the other women of House Matheron presenting a sword to the first Queen of Andor, an event that Matheron treasured, and that might or might not have actually happened. Avienda was already down, pacing restlessly in the hall, and Elaine sighed at the sight. They would have shared a room, if not for the implication that Matheron could not provide adequately for 2 visitors of note. But Avienda did not really understand that the smaller the house, the loftier the pride. Often the smaller houses possessed little more. Pride she should have understood, since a fierce pride and strength all but shone from her. Straight-backed and even taller than Elaine, a thick dark shawl draped over her pale blouse, and a folded gray headscarf holding back her long reddish hair, she was the very picture of a wise one, despite being only a year older than Elaine. Wise ones who could channel often appeared to be much younger than they were, and Avienda had the dignity. At this moment she did anyway, though the pair of them had giggled together often enough. Of course, her only jewelry was a long silver kandori necklace, an amber brooch in the shape of a turtle, and a wide ivory bracelet. And wise ones always wore festoons of necklaces and bracelets. But Avienda was not a wise one yet, merely an apprentice. Elaine never thought of Avienda as merely anything, but it would present problems now and then. Sometimes she thought the wise ones considered her an apprentice of some sort as well, or at least a student. A silly thought, to be sure, but sometimes... As Elaine reached the foot of the stairs, Avienda adjusted her shawl and asked, "Did you sleep well?" Her tone was untroubled, but anxiety nestled around her green eyes. "You did not send for wine to help you sleep, did you? I made sure your wine was watered when we ate, but I saw you looking at the wine pitcher." "Yes, Mother," Elaine said in a sickly sweet voice. "No, Mother. I was wondering how Eatman got his hands on such a fine vintage, Mother. It was a shame to water it, and I drank the goat's milk before I went to sleep." If anything brought her to birthing sickness, it would be goat's milk. And to think she used to like it. Avienda planted her fists on her hips, such an environment of indignation that Elaine had to laugh. There were inconveniences to being with child, ranging from abrupt swings in her temper to tenderness in her breasts to always being tired, but the coddling was the worst in some ways. Everyone in the royal palace knew she was pregnant. A good many had known before she did, courtesy of Min's viewing and Min being too free with her tongue, and she did not think she could have been so mothered when she was an infant. Still, she put up with all the bother with as much grace as she could muster. Usually she did. They were only trying to be helpful. She just wished every woman she knew did not believe that pregnancy had made her brainless. Nearly every woman she knew. Those who had never borne a child themselves were the worst. Thinking of her baby, at times she wished Min had said whether it would be a boy or girl, or rather that Avienda or Brigitte could recall exactly what Min actually had said. Min was always right, but the three of them had consumed a great deal of wine that night, and Min had been gone from the palace long before Elaine herself knew to ask. Thinking of the child growing in her always made her think of Rand, just as thinking of him made her think of the babe. One followed the other as surely as cream rose in the milk pan. She missed Rand terribly, and yet she could not miss him. A part of him, the sense of him, rode always in the back of her head, unless she masked the bond, right alongside her sense of Brigitte, her other warder. The bond had its limits, however. He was somewhere to the west, far enough that she could tell little more than that he was alive. Nothing more, really, though she thought she would know if he had been badly injured. She was not sure she wanted to know what he was up to. He had been far to the south for a long time after leaving her, and now, just this morning, he had traveled to the west. It was disconcerting, really, to feel him in one direction and then suddenly have him off in another, even farther away. He could be pursuing enemies or running from enemies or any one of 1,000 things. She hoped very much it was something innocuous that made him travel. He was going to die on her all too soon. Men who could channel always died of it, but she wanted so very much to keep him alive as long as possible. "He is well," Avienda said, almost as though she could read her mind. They had their own shared sense of one another since their mutual adoption as first sisters, but it did not go as far as the water bond they and Min shared with Rand. If he allows himself to be killed, I will cut off his ears.
Like finish.
Elaine blinked, then laughed again, and after a startled glance, Avienda joined in. It was not that funny, except maybe to an Aiel. Avienda's sense of humor was very odd. But Elaine could not stop laughing, and Avienda seemed as helpless. Shaking with mirth, they hugged one another and hung on. Life was very strange. Had anyone told her a few years ago that she would share a man with another woman, with 2 other women, she would have called them mad. The very idea would have been indecent. But she loved Avienda every bit as much as she did Rand, only in a different way, and Avienda loved Rand as much as she did. Denying that meant denying Avienda, and she could as easily step out of her skin. Aiel women, sisters or close friends, often married the same man, and seldom gave him any say in the matter. She was going to marry Rand, and so was Avienda, and so was Min. Whatever anyone said or thought, that was all there was to it. If he lived long enough. Suddenly she became afraid that her laughter was edging toward tears. Please, Light, let her not be one of those women who became weepy when they were with child. It was bad enough not knowing whether she was going to be melancholy or furious from one minute to the next. Hours might pass when she felt perfectly normal, but then there were hours when she felt like a child's ball bouncing down an endless flight of stairs. This morning she seemed to be on the stairs. "He is well, and he will be well," Avienda whispered fiercely, as if she intended to assure his survival by killing anything that threatened him. With the tips of her fingers, Elaine brushed a tear from her sister's cheek. "He is well, and he will be well," she agreed softly. But they could not kill Saidin, and the taint on the male half of the power was what was going to kill him. The lamps overhead flickered as one of the tall doors to the outside opened, letting in a gust of air even colder than that in the entry hall, and they quickly moved a little apart, just holding hands. Elaine schooled her face to a serene smoothness fully worthy of an Aes Sedai. She could not afford to let anyone see her apparently seeking comfort in a hug. A ruler, or one who sought to rule, was not allowed the slightest suggestion of weakness or tears. Not in public. There were rumors enough about her as it was, as many bad as good. She was benevolent or cruel, fair-minded or arbitrary, generous or avaricious, all according to which tale you listened to. At least the tales balanced out one another. But anyone who could say they had actually seen the daughter heir huddling in the arms of her companion might add a tale of fear to the blend. And if her enemies believed she was afraid, they would only grow bolder and stronger. Cowardice was the sort of rumor that stuck like greasy mud. You could never wash it off completely. History recorded women who had lost their bids for the Lion Throne on no further discernible grounds. Capability was a requirement for a successful ruler, and wisdom was to be hoped for, though women lacking both had gained the throne and muddled through somehow. But few would support a coward, and none of those people she wanted on her side. The man who came in, turning to push the massive door shut behind him, had only one leg, and used a crutch in place of the other. Even with fleece padding, the sleeve of his heavy woolen coat was worn from it. A heavy-shouldered former soldier, Fridwin Ross, managed Lord Eadman's estate, with the aid of a fat clerk who had blinked at the daughter heir in consternation, gaped at her great serpent ring with something near to awe, and scurried back to his ledgers in relief as soon as he realized she had no business with him.
Comment se passe ta journée?
He had probably feared a levy on the manor's accounts. Master Ross had stared at her ring in amazement, to be sure, but he had grinned with delight at the daughter heir, and regretted that he could no longer ride for her with such sincerity that, had he been a liar, he would already have bilked Eadman and the clerk of everything they owned between them. She did not fear him carrying the wrong tales. His crutch made a rhythmic thump as he came up the hall, and he managed a credible bow in spite of it, including Avienda in his courtesy. He had been startled by her at first, but surprisingly quick to catch their friendship, And if he did not entirely trust in Aiel, it meant he accepted her. You could not ask for everything. The men are strapping your cases to the pack animals, my queen, and your escort is ready. He was one of those who refused to call her anything except my queen or majesty, but a hint of doubt entered his voice at mention of her escort. He covered it hastily with a cough and hurried on. The men we're sending with you are all mounted as well as I could manage. Young men, mainly, and a few more experienced, but they all know which end of a halberd has the point. I wish the manor could give you more, but I explained when Lord Eadman heard there were others claiming what's yours by right. He decided not to wait for spring, and he called in his armsmen and set out for Camelin. We've had a couple of bad snowfalls since, but he might be halfway there by now, with luck in the passes. His gaze carried conviction, but he knew better than she that with the wrong luck, Eadman and his armsmen might be dead in those passes. Matherin has always maintained faith with Trakand, Elaine told him, and I put my trust that it always will. I value Lord Eadman's loyalty, Master Ross, and yours. She did not insult Matherin and him by promising to remember or offering rewards. Yet Master Ross's broad smile said she had already given him as much reward as he desired. Matherin would receive rewards if they were earned, but they could not be held out as if offering to buy a horse. Thumping along on his crutch, Master Ross bowed her to the door and bowed her out onto the broad granite step, where servants wearing heavy coats waited in the bitter cold with a stirrup cup of hot spiced wine that she rejected with a murmur. Until she had a chance to adjust to the sharp air, she wanted both hands to hold her cloak closed. Avienda would probably have found a way to make her drop it anyway. She took a cup, after wrapping her shawl around her head and shoulders, the only concession she made to the icy. She was ignoring the cold, of course. Elaine was the one who had taught her how. Elaine tried again to push the cold away, and to her surprise, it receded. Not all the way. She still felt chilly, but it was better than freezing. The sky was clear, the sun bright as it sat over the mountains, but storm clouds could come boiling across the surrounding peaks at any time. It would be best to reach their first destination today as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, Fireheart, her tall black gelding, was living up to his name, rearing and snorting gouts of steamy breath as if he had never worn a bridle before. And Avienda's leggy, arch-necked gray had taken it into her head to imitate him, dancing in the knee-deep snow and trying to go anywhere except where the groom tried to lead her. She was a more spirited animal than Elaine would have chosen for her sister, yet Avienda herself had insisted after learning the mare's name. Siswai meant spear in the old tongue. The grooms seemed capable women, but they appeared to think they needed to calm the animals before handing them over. It was all Elaine could do not to snap at them that she had managed Fireheart before they ever saw him. Her escort was already mounted to avoid standing in the snow. 20-odd with white-colored red coats and bright breastplates and helmets of the Queen's Guard. Master Ross's might be explained by the fact that the riders' coats were silk, as were their red breeches with the white stripe up each leg, and by the pale lace they wore at neck and cuff. They certainly appeared more ceremonial than effective. Or it might have been that they were all women. Women were uncommon in jobs that required using weapons. Just the occasional merchant's guard, or a rare woman who turned up in an army during time of war. And Elaine had never heard of a group of all-female soldiers before she created one. Except the maidens, of course. But they were Aiel, no matter. She hoped people would think them an affectation on her part, and largely decorative with all the lace and silk. Men tended to underestimate a woman carrying weapons until they faced one, and even most other women tended to think her a brainless fool. Bodyguards usually tried to appear so ferocious that no one would dare trying to get her. But her enemies would just find a new way to attack, if she stood the whole Queen's Guard around her, shoulder to shoulder. A bodyguard her enemies would dismiss until it was too late for more than regrets was her aim. She intended to make their uniforms more elaborate, partly to feed those conceptions, and partly to feed the women's pride as soldiers marked out from the rest. But she herself had no doubts. Every one of them, from merchants' guards to hunters of the Horn, had been carefully chosen for her skills, experience, and courage. She was ready to put her life in their hands. She already had. A lean woman wearing a lieutenant's 2 golden knots on the shoulder of her red cloak saluted Elaine with an arm across her chest, and her roan gelding tossed his head, making the silver bells in his mane chime faintly, as if he too were saluting. "We are ready, my lady, and the area is clear." Kasela Razkovny was one of those who had been a merchant's guard, and her Arafellan accents were not those of an educated woman, but her voice was brisk and no-nonsense. She used the proper form of address and would until Elaine was crowned, yet she was ready to fight to gain that crown for Elaine. Very, very few, male or female, signed the roster of the Queen's Guard these days, unless they were ready for that. "The men Master Ross handed over are ready too, as ready as they'll ever be." Clearing his throat, the man shifted his crutch and took to studying the snow in front of his boots. Elaine could see what Kasela meant. Master Ross had scraped together 11 men from the manor to send to Camelin and outfitted them with halberds and short swords and what armor he could find, 9 antique helmets without face guards, and 7 breastplates with dents that made them vulnerable. Their mounts were not bad, though hairy with their winter coats. But even huddled as their riders were in thick cloaks, she could see that 8 were unlikely to need to shave above once in a week, if that. The men Master Ross had described as being experienced had wrinkled faces and bony hands, and probably not a full set of teeth between them. He had not been lying or trying to stint. Eatman would have gathered all the fit men in the area to take with him and outfitted them in the best he had. The story had been the same everywhere. Apparently a great number of hale and hearty men scattered the length of Andor were trying to reach her in Camelin, and none of them likely to get into the city until all was decided now. She could search every day without finding a single band. Still, this little bunch held their halberds as if they knew how to use them. Then again, that was not hard to do, sitting a saddle at rest with the halberd's butt tucked in your stirrup. She could have managed that. "We have visited 19 of these manors, sister," Avienda said softly, moving closer until their shoulders touched. "And counting these, we have gathered 250 boys too young to be blooded, and old men who should have laid down the spear long ago. I have not asked before. You know your people and your ways. Is this worth the time you give it?" "Oh yes, sister." Elaine kept her voice just as low, so the one-legged former soldier and the servants could not overhear. The best of people could turn mule-headed if they realized you wanted them to behave a certain way. Particularly if they realized that the help they had painfully gathered and offered and you had accepted was not what you were after at all. "Everyone in that village down by the river knows I'm here by now, and so do half the farms for miles. By noon, the other half will know, and by tomorrow, the next village over and more farms. News travels slowly in winter, especially in this country. They know I've spoken my claim to the throne, yet if I gain the throne tomorrow or die tomorrow, they might not learn of it before the middle of spring, maybe not even until summer. But today they know that Elaine Trakand is alive, that she visited the manor in silks and jewels, and summoned men to her banner. People 20 miles from here will claim they saw me and touched my hand. Few people can say that without speaking in favor of whoever they claim to have seen. And when you speak in favor of someone, you convince yourself to favor them. There are men and women in 19 places around Andor talking about how they saw the daughter heir just this last week, and every day the area that talk covers spreads like an ink blot. If I had time, I'd visit every village in Andor. It won't make a hair of difference in what happens in Camelin, but it may make all the difference after I win." She would not admit to any possibility other than winning, especially not given who would take the throne if she failed. Most queens in our history spent the first years of their rule gathering the people solidly behind them, Avienda, and some never did. But harder times than these are coming. I may not have 1 year before I need every Andoran to stand behind me. I can't wait until I have the throne. Harder times are coming, and I have to be ready. Andor has to be ready, and I must make it so, she finished firmly. Smiling, Avienda touched Elaine's cheek. I think I will learn a great deal about being a wise one from you. To her mortification, Elaine blushed in embarrassment. Her cheeks felt on fire. Maybe the swings in humor were worse than the cosseting. Light. She had months of this to look forward to. Not for the first time, she found a kernel of resentment toward Rand. He had done this to her. All right, she had helped him. Instigated the doing, in fact, and that was the point. He had done this and walked away with a smug grin on his face. She thought his grin had really been smug, but she could picture it all too easily. Let him dart from giddy to weep and see how he liked it. A straight line, she thought irritably. That was his fault, too. The grooms finally deemed Fireheart and Avienda's Siswai meek enough to be by ladies, and Avienda climbed to her saddle from the stone mounting block with a good deal more grace than she once had shown, arranging her bulky, undivided skirts to cover as much of her dark stockinged legs as possible. She still believed that her own legs were superior to hers, yet she had become a passable rider, though she did have a tendency to look surprised when the horse did as she wanted. Fireheart tried to dance once Elaine was on his back, but she reined him in smartly, and more sharply than she would have normally. Her teetering moods had taken her to a sudden sense of dread for Rand, and if she could not ensure his safety, there was one male at hand she could make certain did exactly as he was supposed to. 6 of the guardswomen led the way down the road from the manor at a slow walk, all the depth of snow would allow, with the rest following her and Avienda in smart columns, the last horsewomen in line leading the pack animals. The local men trailed behind raggedly with their own pack horse, a shaggy creature tied about with cookpots and rough bundles, and even half a dozen live chickens. A few cheers greeted them as they rode through the thatch-roofed village, and across the stone bridge that crossed a snake-curved frozen stream, loud cries of "Elaine of the Lily!" and "Trakand! Trakand!" and "Matherin stands!" But she saw a woman crying on her husband's chest, and tears on his face too, and another woman who stood with her back to the riders and her head down, refusing even to look. Elaine hoped she would send their sons home to them. There should be little fighting at Camelin unless she blundered badly, but there would be something. And once the Rose Crown was hers, battles lay ahead. To the south lay the Seanchan, and to the north Myrdral and Trollocs waiting to descend for Tarman Gaiden. Andor would bleed sons in the days to come. Burn her? She was not going to cry. Beyond the bridge, the road slanted up again, a steep climb through pine and fir and leatherleaf, but it was no more than a long mile to the mountain meadow they sought. The snow shining beneath the mid-morning sun still bore the marks of hooves, coming from where a gateway had left a deep furrow in the snow. It could have been nearer the manor, but the possibility of someone standing where your gateway opened was always the danger. The glow of Saidar surrounded Avienda as they rode into the meadow. She had made the gateway to come here from their last stop yesterday afternoon, the manor 100 miles north, so she would weave the gateway to go to Camelin, but the sight of Avienda shining with the power made Elaine go broody. Whoever made the gateway to leave Camelin always ended up making all the others until they returned, since she learned the ground at each place her gateway touched. But on each of their 5 trips, Avienda had asked to make that first gateway. She might simply have wanted the practice, as she claimed, though Elaine hardly had more practice than she did. But another possibility had come to mind. Maybe Avienda wanted to keep her from channeling, in any considerable amount at least, because she was pregnant. The weave that had made them sisters of the same mother could not have been used if either of them had been with child, because the unborn child would have shared in the bond, a thing it could not be strong enough to survive. But surely one of the Aes Sedai in the palace would have said something if channeling was to be avoided in pregnancy. Then again, very few Aes Sedai ever bore children. They might not know. She was aware there were many things Aes Sedai did not know, however much they might pretend otherwise to the rest of the world. She herself had taken advantage of that presumption from time to time. But it seemed very strange that they might be ignorant of something so important to most women. It was as though a bird knew how to eat every seed and grain except barley, so supposedly knew, because if it did not know how to eat barley, what else might it be ignorant of? Wise ones bore children, though, and they had said nothing about them. Abruptly, concerns over her babe and channeling and what Aes Sedai might or might not know were pushed right out of her head. She could feel someone channeling Saidar. Not Avienda, not someone on one of the surrounding mountains, not anyone near as close as that. This was distant, like a beacon blazing on a far mountain top in the night. A very distant mountain. She could not imagine how much of the One Power was needed for her to feel channeling at that distance. Every woman in the world who could channel must be able to sense this, to point straight to it. And the beacon lay to the west. Nothing had changed in the bond with Rand. She could not have said exactly where he was within 100 miles, but she knew. "He's in danger," she said. "We must go to him, Avienda." Avienda gave herself a shake and stopped staring westward. The glow remained around her, and Elaine could feel that she had drawn on the source as deeply as she could. But even as Avienda turned to her, she felt the amount of Saidar the other woman held dwindle. "We must not, Elaine." Aghast, Elaine twisted in Fireheart's saddle to stare at her. "You want to abandon him? To that?" No one could handle so much of Saidar, not the strongest circle, not unaided. Supposedly a Sa'angreal existed greater than anything else ever made, and if what she had heard was correct, that might be able to handle this. Maybe. But from what she had heard, no woman could use it and live, not without Turangreal made for the purpose, and no one had ever seen one that she knew of. Surely no sister would try, even if she had found one. That much of the One Power could level mountain ranges at a stroke. No sister would try, except perhaps one of the Black Aja, or worse, one of the Forsaken. Maybe more than one. What else could it be? And Avienda simply wanted to ignore it when she must know that Rand was there? The guardswomen, unaware, were still waiting patiently on their horses, keeping watch on the tree line around the meadow, and little concerned with that after their reception of the manor. Though Casela was watching Elaine and Avienda, a slight frown visible behind the face bars of her helmet. She knew they never delayed at opening a gateway. The men from the manor were gathering around their pack horses, pawing at the bundles and apparently arguing over whether or not something had been included. Avienda still moved her gray closer to Elaine's black and spoke in a voice that would not carry. "We know nothing, Elaine. Not whether he is dancing the spears or this is something else. If he dances the spears and we rush in, will he attack us before he knows who we are? Will we distract him because he does not expect us and allow his enemies to win? If he dies, we will find who took his life and kill them. But if we go to him now, we go blindly, and we may bring disaster on our backs." "We could be careful," Elaine said sullenly. It infuriated her that she was feeling sullen and showing it, but all she could do was ride her moods and try not to let them get the upper hand completely. "We don't have to travel right to the spot." Gripping her pouch, feeling the small ivory carving of a seated woman that nestled inside, she looked pointedly at her sister's amber brooch. "Light, Avienda. We have Angreal, and neither of us is exactly helpless." Oh, Light. Now she was sounding petulant. She knew very well that both of them together, Angreal and all, would be flies battling a flame against what they could sense. But even so, a fly bite at the right moment might make the difference. And don't tell me I'll endanger the baby. Min said she will be born strong and healthy. You told me so yourself. That means I will live at least long enough for my daughter to be born. She hoped for a daughter. Fireheart chose that moment to nip at the gray, and Siswai nipped back. And for a bit, Elaine was occupied with getting her gelding under control, and keeping Avienda from being thrown, and telling Casela that they did not need any help. And by the end of it, she was not feeling sullen any longer. She wanted to smack Fireheart right between his ears. Aside from making the animal obey the reins, Avienda behaved as if nothing had happened at all. She did frown, a little uncertainly, her face framed by the dark wool of her shawl, but her uncertainty had nothing to do with the horse. I have told you about the rings in Ruidian, she said slowly, and Elaine gave an impatient nod. Every woman who wanted to become a wise one was sent through a Turangreal before she began training. It was something like the Turangreal used to test novices for being raised to accepted in the White Tower, except that in this one, a woman saw her whole life. All of her possible lives, really, every decision made differently, an infinite fan of lives based on differing choices. No one can remember all of that, Elaine, only bits and pieces. I knew I would love Randall Thor. She was still uncomfortable sometimes about using just his first name in front of others. And that I would find sister wives. For most things, all you retain is a vague impression at best. A hint of warning sometimes. I think if we go to him now, something very bad will happen. Maybe one of us will die. Maybe both, in spite of what Min said. That she said Min's name without fumbling was a measure of her concern. She did not know Min very well, and usually named her formally as Min Farshaw. Perhaps he will die. Perhaps something else. I do not know for sure. Maybe we will all survive, and we will sit around a fire with him, toasting Pakara when we find him. But the glimmer of a warning is there in my head. Elaine opened her mouth angrily. Then she closed it again, anger draining away like water down a hole, and her shoulders slumped. Perhaps Avienda's glimmer was true, and perhaps not. But the fact was that her arguments had been good from the start. A great risk taken in ignorance, and taking it might bring disaster. The beacon had grown brighter still, and he was there, right where the beacon was. The bond did not tell her so, not at this distance, but she knew. And she knew she had to leave him to take care of himself, while she took care of Andor. I don't have anything to teach you about being a wise one, Avienda, she said quietly. You are already much wiser than I, not to mention braver and more cool-headed. We return to Camelin. Avienda colored faintly under the praise. She could be very sensitive at times, but she wasted no time in opening the gateway, a rotating view of a stable yard in the royal palace that widened into a hole in the air and let snow from the meadow fall onto the clean-swept paving stones as near 300 miles away as made no difference. The sense of Birgitta, somewhere in the palace, sprang alive in Elaine's head. Birgitta had a headache and a sour stomach. Not unusual occurrences of late, but they suited Elaine's mood all too well. I must leave him to take care of himself, she thought, as she rode through. Light. How often had she thought that? No matter. Rand was the love of her heart and the joy of her life, but Andor was her duty. Chapter 11. Talk of Debts. The gateway was positioned so that Elaine seemed to be riding out of a hole in the wall against the street into a square marked out for safety by sand-filled wine barrels standing on the paving stones. Oddly, she could not feel a single woman channeling anywhere in the palace, though it housed more than 150 with the ability. Some would be stationed on the city's outer walls, of course, too far for her to sense anything short of a linked circle, and a few would be out of the city altogether. Yet someone in the palace was almost always using Saidar, whether to try forcing one of the captive Suldam to admit that she really could see weaves of the One Power, or simply to smooth the wrinkles from a shawl without heating an iron. Not this morning, though. Windfinder arrogance often matched the worst shown by any Aes Sedai, yet even that must be quashed by what they sensed. Elaine thought that if she climbed to a high window, she must be able to see the weaves of that great beacon, hundreds of leagues distant as they were. She felt like an ant that had just become aware of mountains, an ant comparing the spine of the world to the hills it had always held in awe. Yes, even the Windfinders must be walking small in the face of that. On the eastern side of the palace, and fronted on north and south by two-story-high stables of pure white stone, the Queen's stable yard traditionally was given over to the Queen's personal horses and carriages, and she had hesitated over using it before the Lion Throne was acknowledged hers. The steps that led to the throne were as delicate as any court dance, and if the dance sometimes came to resemble a tavern brawl, you still had to make your steps with grace and precision in order to gain. Claiming the perquisites before being confirmed had cost some women their chance to rule. In the end, she had decided it was not a transgression that would make her seem overproud. Besides, the Queen's stable yard was relatively small and had no other use. There were fewer people to keep away from an opening gateway here. In fact, when she entered it, the stone-paved yard was empty, apart from a single red-coated groom standing in one of the arched stable doorways, but he turned to give a shout inside, and dozens more came spilling out as she guided Fireheart clear of the marked-off square. After all, she might have returned with an entourage of powerful lords or ladies, or perhaps they just hoped she had. Casela brought the guardswomen through the gateway and ordered most to dismount and see to their animals. She and half a dozen more remained in their saddles, keeping watch over the heads of the people afoot. Even here she would not leave Elaine unguarded, particularly here, where she faced more danger than in any manor she had visited. The Matherin men milled about, getting in the way of grooms and guards while gaping at the white stone balconies and colonnades that overlooked the yard and the spires and golden domes visible beyond. The cold seemed less here than in the mountains. Refusing to let it touch her, as far as she could at present, did not make her totally unaware. But men and women and horses all still breathed faint plumes of mist. The odor of horse dung seemed strong, too, after the clean air of the mountains. A hot bath in front of a roaring fire would be welcome. Afterward, she would have to plunge back into the business of securing the throne, but right now a long soak would be just the thing. A pair of grooms ran to Fireheart. One took his bridle with a hurried curtsy for Elaine, more concerned with seeing that the tall gelding made no bother while Elaine dismounted than with making courtesies herself, and another who made his bow and remained bent with his hands making a stirrup for Elaine. Neither gave more than a glance at the view of a snow-covered mountain meadow where they would normally see a stone wall. The stable workers were accustomed to gateways by now. She had heard that they garnered drinks in the taverns by boasting of how often they saw the power used, and the things they supposedly had seen done with it. Elaine could imagine what those tales sounded like by the time they reached Aramilla. She rather enjoyed the thought of Aramilla chewing her fingernails. As she set foot on the paving stones, a cluster of guardswomen appeared around her, in crimson hats with white plumes lying flat on the broad brims, and lace-edged crimson sashes, embroidered with the white lion that slanted across their bright breastplates. Not until then did Casela take the remainder of Elaine's escort to the stable. Their replacements were just as wary, eyes watching every direction, hands hovering near their sword hilts, except for Denny, a wide, placid-faced woman who carried a long, brass-studded cudgel. They were only 9 in number. Only 9, Elaine thought bitterly. I need only 9 bodyguards in the royal palace itself. Yet everyone who carried a sword was expert.
Women who followed the trade of the sword, as Casella called it, had to be good, or else sooner or later they were cut down by some fellow whose only advantage was strength enough to batter her down. Denny possessed no facility with the sword at all, but the few men who had tested her cudgel regretted doing so. Despite her bulk, Denny was very quick, and she had no concept of fighting fair, or of practice for that matter. Rasoria, the stocky under-lieutenant in charge, seemed relieved when the grooms led Fireheart off. If Elaine's bodyguard had their way, no one except themselves would have been allowed within arm's reach. Well, maybe they were not quite that bad, but they looked with suspicion at almost everyone except Birgitta and Avienda. Rasoria, a Tyran despite her blue eyes and the yellow hair she wore cut short, was among the worst in that regard, even insisting on watching the cooks make Elaine's meals, and having everything tasted before it was brought up. Elaine had not protested, however overzealous they might be. One experience of drugged wine was more than enough, even when she knew she would live at least long enough to bear her child. But it was neither the guardswomen's mistrust nor the need for it that tightened her mouth. It was Birgitta, weaving her way through the crowded stable yard, but not toward her. Avienda was last to appear out of the gateway, of course, after she was sure that everyone was through, and before she let the gateway wink out of existence, Elaine started in her direction, striding off so suddenly that her escort had to leap to maintain their guarding ring around her. As quickly as she moved, though, Birgitta, with her thick golden braid hanging to her waist, was there first, helping Avienda down and handing the gray mare over to a long-faced groom who seemed almost as leggy as Siswai. Avienda always had more difficulty getting off a horse than getting on, but Birgitta had more than assistance in mind. Elaine and her escort arrived just in time to hear the woman say to Avienda in a low, hurried voice, "Did she drink her goat's milk? Did she get enough sleep? She feels..." Her voice trailed off at the end, and she drew a deep breath before turning to face Elaine, outwardly calm and unsurprised to find her right there. The bond did work both ways. Birgitta was not a big woman, though she stood taller than Elaine in her heeled boots, as tall as Avienda, but she usually had a presence that was only heightened by the uniform of the Captain General of the Queen's Guards, a short red coat with a high white collar, worn over baggy blue trousers tucked into gleaming black boots, 4 golden knots on her left shoulder, and 4 bands of gold on each white cuff. After all, she was Birgitta Silverbow, a hero out of legend. She remained wary of trying to live up to those legends. She claimed that the stories were grossly inflated where they were not complete fabrications. Yet she was still the same woman who had done every one of the things that formed the heart of those legends, and more besides. Now, despite her apparent composure, unease tinged the concern for Elaine that flowed through the bond, along with her headache and her sullen stomach. She knew very well that Elaine hated for them to check on her behind her back. That was not the whole reason for Elaine's irritation, but the bond let Birgitta know just how upset she was. Avienda, calmly unwrapping her shawl from around her head and draping it over her shoulders, attempted the gaze of a woman who had done nothing wrong, and certainly was not involved with anyone else who had done anything wrong. She might have managed it, if she had not widened her eyes for an added touch of innocence. Birgitta was a bad influence on her in some ways. "I drank the goat's milk," Elaine said in a level voice, all too conscious of the guardswomen ringing the 3 of them. Facing outward, eyes scanning the yard and the balconies and the rooftops, nearly every one was certainly listening. "I got enough sleep. Is there anything else you want to ask me?" Avienda's cheeks colored faintly. "I think I have all the answers I need for the moment," Birgitta replied, without a hint of the blush Elaine had been hoping for. The woman knew she was tired, knew she had to be lying about the sleep. The bond was decidedly inconvenient at times. She had drunk nothing but half a cup of extremely well-watered wine last night, but she was beginning to have Birgitta's morning after head and her sour stomach. None of the other Aes Sedai she had spoken to about the bond had mentioned anything of the kind. But she and Birgitta all too often mirrored one another, physically and emotionally. The last presented real problems when her moods were on a seesaw. Sometimes she managed to shrug it off or fight it off, but today she knew she was going to have to suffer until Birgitta was healed. She thought the mirroring must occur because they were both women. No one had heard of anyone bonding another woman before. Few had heard of it now, to tell the truth, and some of them seemed to believe it could not be true. A warder was male as surely as a bull was male. Everyone knew that, and not many stopped to think that anything that everyone knew deserved close examination. Being caught in a lie when she was trying to follow Egwene's dictate about living as if she had already taken the 3 oaths made Elaine defensive, and that made her blunt. "Is Dylan back?" "No," Birgitta said just as bluntly, and Elaine sighed. Dylan had left the city days before Aramilla's army appeared, taking Rihanna Corley with her to make gateways and speed her travel, and a great deal depended on Dylan's return. On what news she brought back, on whether she brought anything besides news. Choosing who would be Queen of Andor was quite simple, boiled down to essentials. There were over 400 houses in the realm, but only 19 strong enough that others would follow where they led. Usually all 19 stood behind the daughter heir, or most of them, unless she was plainly incompetent. House Mantiar had lost the throne to Trakand when Mordrellin died, only because Tigraine, the daughter heir, had vanished, and Mantiar had begun running heavily to boy children, and because Morghese Trakand had gathered 13 houses in her support. Only 10 of the 19 were necessary to ascend the throne by law and custom. Even claimants who still thought they should have the throne themselves usually fell in with the rest, or at least fell silent and gave up their pursuit, once another woman had 10 houses at her back. Things had been bad enough when she had 3 declared rivals, but now Nayan and Elenia were united behind Aramilla Marn, of all people, the least likely of the 3 to have succeeded. And that meant she had 2 houses, 2 large enough to count. Matherin and those 18 others she had visited were too small, her own Trakand and Dylan's Taravin to face 6. Oh, Dylan insisted that Karand, Koalan, and Renshar would come to Elaine, and Norwellin and Pendar and Tremaine besides. But the first 3 wanted Dylan herself on the throne, and the last 3 seemed to have gone into hibernation. Dylan was firm in her loyalty, though, and tireless on Elaine's behalf. She persisted in her belief that some of the houses that were keeping silent could be convinced to support Elaine. Of course, Elaine could not approach them herself, but Dylan could. And now the situation verged on desperate. 6 houses supporting Aramilla, and only a fool would think she had not sent feelers out toward the others. Or that some might listen just because she did have 6 already. Despite the fact that Kassela and her guards had vacated the courtyard, Elaine and the others had to thread their way across the paving stones through a crowd. The men from Matherin were finally down off their horses, but they were still moiling about, dropping their halberds and picking them up only to drop them again, trying to unload their pack horse there in the stable yard. One of the boys was chasing a chicken that somehow had gotten loose and was scuttling between the horse's legs, while one of the wrinkled old men shouted encouragement, though whether for the boy or the chicken was unclear. A leather-faced bannerman with the merest fringe of white hair remaining in a faded red coat that strained across his belly was trying to establish order with the help of an only slightly younger guardsman, both of them likely returned from their pensions, as a good many had, but another of the boys seemed about to lead his shaggy horse into the palace itself, and Birgitta had to order him out of the way before Elaine could enter. The boy, a fuzz-cheeked lad who could not have been above 14, gaped at Birgitta as widely as he had at the palace. She was certainly more picturesque in her uniform than the daughter heir in a riding dress, and he'd already seen the daughter heir. Rasoria gave him a shove back toward the old bannerman, shaking her head. "I don't flaming know what I can do with them," Birgitta grumbled, as a maid liveried in red and white took Elaine's cloak and gloves in the small entry hall. small in terms of the royal palace. With gilded stand lamps flickering between narrow, fluted white columns, it was half again the size of Matherin's main entry hall, though the ceiling was not so high. Another maid with the white line on the left breast of her dress, a girl not that much older than the boy who had tried to bring his horse inside, offered a ropework silver tray with tall cups of steaming spiced wine, before simultaneous frowns from Avienda and Birgitta made her shy back. The flaming boys fall asleep if they're put on guard, Birgitta went on, scowling at the retreating maid. The old men stay awake but half can't remember what they're flaming supposed to do if they see somebody trying to scale the bloody wall, and the other half together couldn't fight off 6 shepherds with a dog. Avienda raised an eyebrow at Elaine and nodded. They aren't here to fight, Elaine reminded them, as they started down a blue-tiled corridor, lined with mirrored stand lamps and inlaid chests. Birgitta and Avienda on either side of her, and the guardswomen spreading out a few paces ahead of them and behind. Light, she thought. I wouldn't have taken the wine. Her head pounded in rhythm with Birgitta's, and she touched her temple, wondering whether she should order her warder to go find healing immediately. Birgitta had other ideas, though. She eyed Rasoria and the others in front, then looked over her shoulder and motioned those following to fall back a little more. That was strange. She had handpicked every last woman in the guards, and she trusted them. Even so, when she spoke, it was in a hurried, near whisper, bending her head close to Elaine. Something happened just before you returned. I was asking Sumiko if she'd heal me before you got back, and she suddenly fell over in a faint. Her eyes just rolled up in her head, and down she went. It isn't only her. Nobody will admit a flaming thing, not to me, but the other kin I've seen have been jumping out of their bloody skins, and the Windfinders too. Not one of them could spit if she had to. You were back before I could find a sister, but I suspect they'd give me the fisheye too. They'll tell you, though. The palace required the population of a large village to keep.
Alright, everyone. I'm gonna call into his life for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone keep stopping by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support.
Très bien tout le monde, je vais appeler pour ce soir. Je tiens à remercier tout le monde d'être passé et de se détendre avec moi. Je vous apprécie tous. À la prochaine fois, restez en sécurité.